Imagine you are a manager of a supermarket and you are working with health authorities to increase the purchase of healthy foods, let's say broccoli. What would you change? What comes to mind might be changing price, creating attractive displays, or providing information on how to make tasty dishes with broccoli. But there might be other surprising options, according to our guests, neuroeconomists Scott Huettel and Nicolette Sullivan. I'm Kelly Brownell, Director of the World Food Policy Center at Duke University and Professor of Public Policy at Duke. And this is the Leading Voices in Food podcast series. Dr. Scott Huettel is Chair of the Department of Psychology and Neuroscience at Duke University, and Dr. Nicolette Sullivan is finishing a postdoctoral fellowship at Duke before joining the faculty of the London School of Economics as Assistant Professor of Marketing. Nikki, let's begin with you. Many people may not be familiar with your professional specialty, neuroeconomics. Could you please explain what this is?
Absolutely. So the word neuroeconomics comes from joining two different academic disciplines, neuroscience and economics. And so the idea is to use techniques from neuroscience and psychology so that we can gain a better understanding of actually how we make economic and social decisions. The idea behind that is not just to understand why people make the choices that they do, but to use that information to help us improve predictions of behavior, as well as to use that information to improve interventions to improve people's choices.
Well, thank you for that explanation. It's a very exciting field. Scott, you and Nikki and colleagues did a fascinating study published in the journal Psychological Science. What is the main problem that your study was designed to address? And can you explain how the study was designed?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So we were interested in how people make simple dietary choices, such as between an indulgent option like a candy bar and a discipline option like a piece of broccoli. And we know that many people often will choose indulgent options even when they have a long-term goal to eat healthy options. So we wanted to understand the mechanisms behind these choices and also to identify ways of shaping decisions so that people make more of these healthier choices. So we gave people choices between pairs of food items, like, again, candy bars and broccoli. But for some of those choices, we introduced a novel manipulation. It's something that's called a common consequence. Now, a common consequence is something you might receive regardless of what you choose. So it's a option that you have some chance of getting no matter what else you choose. Now, decision science says that these common consequences should be irrelevant to your choices, meaning that you should only choose based on the things that differ based on the consequence of your choice. But we had the intuition based on some other research that this could actually drive behavior, so it could push people's choices around. So we wanted to see how these common consequences could drive choice behavior. And we also thought they might have an influence on how people attended, that they might drive attention, in this case, toward the more disciplined food items. And so we measured attention simultaneously with the subject's choice behavior using a technique called eye tracking.
Can you explain just quickly what eye tracking involves?
Yeah, eye tracking involves basically a camera that looks a lot like a webcam, and it uses a very weak infrared light to identify the position of the eye, and basically a reflection off your eye, and can identify where you're looking on a computer screen with pretty good precision. And so we can tell where someone is looking over a display and identify the location within, let's say, a few pixels of difference on the screen, and we can measure that about 60 times a second.
So, Nikki, would you describe what the main findings were from the study?
So what we found was that when you add more disciplined foods to a choice set, when you add a common consequence that is something that's healthy but not tasty, like spinach, for example, or broccoli, your decisions don't really change that much. But when we add more indulgent foods, like more potato chips or candy bars as the common consequence, people ended up actually choosing the healthier options more often.
So, Nikki, if you were the supermarket manager then and you were attempting to maximize the purchase of broccoli, how would you take the results from your study and change things?
What we think that we're doing by introducing these more indulgent foods like candy bars is that we're creating what psychologists call a pop-out effect. And what that means is basically in a sea of candy bars, one green apple will stand out. What we found is that is drawing people's attention to the healthier items and making them basically easier to choose. In contrast, the food desert interventions that are often used, they segregate the healthier options. They remain in a separate section, for example, adding a produce section to a corner market. And that would be easy to ignore, to walk right past it to the potato chips, which is what people do. So our findings indicate that segregating these healthier items is exactly what we should not be doing. Instead, a more effective approach may be to add these healthier options to the snack food aisle to draw consumers' attention and hopefully make it easier for them to make that healthy choice.
So, Scott, why do you think all this happens? Nikki mentioned the pop-out effect. Is that pretty much the reason, or is there more to it than that?
Well, I think there's several reasons. So the pop-out effect is one of our best hypotheses for why this happens. There's other explanations in a sense, at different levels. So one possibility is that this pop-out effect is actually part of a process that actually changes how people perceive the healthfulness and taste of foods. One thing we know from much research in decision science is that the value of an item depends on what's around it. So in the case of food, a food that is surrounded by more healthful items may actually seem less healthful in consequence. And so we did some analyses in the study to look at how presenting these common consequences actually changes how people see the healthfulness and taste of food items. And what seems to be the case is if you introduce these irrelevant common consequences that are very indulgent, so tasty but not healthy, it actually turns out to emphasize the disciplined nature, the health consequences of the foods the person is choosing from. In other words, by putting sort of irrelevant options around it that are very tasty, it actually changes how people perceive the healthfulness of the options they're choosing between. And so this seems particularly important because it emphasizes, as Nikki mentioned, the idea that how you perceive a food very much will depend upon the qualities of the food surrounding it, in some cases very literally surrounding it, as in the cases of an array of food in a supermarket or corner store.
Does it also affect how people perceive the less healthy options?
Yeah, so we think it does, although one thing that was interesting is we had an asymmetry in the results. So we found, as Nikki mentioned, that these common indulgent consequences pushed people toward making more disciplined choices. So that's great. I mean, that's what we wanted to see if there's an intervention. But the math predicts that we should see it in both directions. We should actually see if people have, in this case, the common discipline consequence, it should make people make worse indulgent choices. And we didn't see that there was a increased number of indulgent choices in this study. Now, one feature is that people tend to default to indulgent choices. And so there's possibly a floor effect that people are already so biased toward making indulgent choices, there's just not much room to push them more toward those choices. So we think that the mechanism should work in both directions. You can push people toward making better choices or worse. But in our study, we only found the one direction, pushing people toward making better, more disciplined choices by introducing this manipulation.
Boy, this work is absolutely fascinating. Nikki, where do you see this work going in the future, and what sort of applications do you think it may have?
The idea that you can introduce a sort of a disciplined item to a larger array of indulgent items to get people to make healthier choices, I think that is a very interesting avenue for future food desert interventions to try, because as far as I know, they really haven't tried anything like that before. And our results suggest it could have a profound impact on people's choices.
Well, thank you both so much for this. The work, as I said, is fascinating and has far-ranging implications, and it'll be really nice to see how your work proceeds in the future. So thank you again for joining us.
Thanks so much for having us.
And thank you to our listeners. Please subscribe to the Leading Voices in Food at Google Play, Stitcher, Radio Public, or Apple Podcast, or by visiting our website of the Duke World Food Policy Center. This is Kelly Brownell.